what we call an orchestra today was not what we see today and hear today when the so-called orchestra began. Um, it's hard to say when. It probably begins as soon as a few people had any kind of idea of instruments. But just getting to where our course begins with Handel, in the 18th century, older instruments still were current and were common. Viols, which were six-stringed and were fretted, were still side by side with the newer violins, which were four-stringed instruments and didn't have frets. You had to find the right pitch through your expertise. There were dulcians, but there were also bassoons. There were shawms, but there were also oboes. So there were flageolets, and there were recorders, and there were flutes. So when we come to the time of Handel, there were keyboards. These were harpsichords and clavichords primarily. And the clavichord was for the home, but the harpsichord was for the orchestra. It was for the bigger sound. Organs for church, sometimes also in a concert. So the standardizing of the orchestra probably owes a good deal to the court of Louis XIV. In the time of Lully, which is the later 17th century, and then continuing into the 18th with someone like Rameau, you had what was known the 24 violins of the king. And those violins were what we call violins, but also what we call violas and what we call cellos. And they played music for the king and for all events. And under Lully, who was a very strict disciplinarian, they played very precisely and very accurately and developed fame for being an extremely good group. When needed, and this is true for the Handel water music, when needed, more and more often than not, oboes and French horns and bassoons added rhythm, added punctuation, added color, participated in harmony, could participate in melody, especially the oboes and the bassoons. So in Handel, you get an orchestra of strings, maybe 24. We know there were 50 for the water music, but maybe 24, 30 would be the average. And then you would have a couple of oboe players and a couple of bassoon players and some, often, not always, some horns. Conceivably, for bombastic music, a couple of trumpets and a drum. Now, the interesting thing about the bassoon is that because it is a bass-oon, a bass woodwind instrument, its customary role in the 18th century was to join the keyboard and a low-stringed instrument like the viola da gamba or the cello or the double bass or the violone, whatever instrument was current, in playing the so-called figured bass line or the basso continuo, sometimes an unfigured bass line. But the bassoon was part of the foundation line for the rest of the orchestra, primarily for the strings. But as we go through the 18th century, the bassoon takes on more of an independent life and becomes the bass woodwind instrument who can do very wonderful acrobatic melodic music. So as we go through the late Baroque and into the classical era of Haydn and Mozart and the early Beethoven, the orchestra becomes more standardized as having one or two flutes, a couple of oboes, starting maybe in opera and then moving to symphony later in the 18th century, the clarinets, the bassoon, the pair of bassoons. So one or two flutes, but usually two oboes, two bassoons, two clarinets by the time you get to late Mozart and late Haydn, where the clarinets become a standard instrument. And you have the French horns, and you have the trumpets and the timpani for the kinds of music that welcome more of the military flavor of those instruments. And, and you have the whole complement of strings, first violins and second violins, so that there is division of labor among these two same instrument but playing different lines. You have violas and you have cellos and you have basses. For the longest time the basses double the cellos, but by the time really of Beethoven and through Beethoven and later the double basses become emancipated and have their own music, which becomes increasingly intriguing and impressive. In the 19th century, as we move from Beethoven through Schubert and Schumann and Berlioz and Wagner and Brahms and Bruckner and Mahler and Strauss, many more instruments take place, starting with the trombones in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony finale, and beautifully used, say, in Schubert's great C major symphony. Trombones, usually there'd be three of them, three trombones, adding some more gravitas, some more bass voices. The tuba comes in later. By the time you get to Wagner's great operas, the early ones even, like Lohengrin and Flying Dutchman, the brasses are playing an ever-increased role, and instead of two horns, which is true even in some Beethoven, you would have two pairs of horns. You'd have four horns. And so you're going to have flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets, trombones, timpani, and strings. We're going to add things to that now. And they come up really again starting with Beethoven, and then through the Romanticists I named before. One flute player would probably play the piccolo, which is, as you know, a very high-pitched flute. Eventually, the piccolo player would be a separate individual. But in the early days, a flutist played piccolo, and sometimes in late music, sometimes even in today's music. If the role for a piccolo were very small, a flute player would switch to piccolo briefly. The oboe was joined by its alto friend, the English horn, which is that beautiful, nostalgic, piercing sound that we get in Berlioz a lot and in Wagner, in that romantic style. The clarinets were joined by a bass clarinet. And the bassoons even, which are already quite low in sound, are joined by a contrabassoon, just as the cellos have their friends, the contrabasses, alias double basses. What are we missing? We are missing percussion. And while we have really just the timpani in Mozart and in Haydn works, we do have triangle, cymbals, and bass drum in a lot of symphonic music, but we will hear it in the Turkish march movement of the Ninth Symphony. And those three instruments become staples of the orchestra. But as you go through the time of Berlioz, and he writes his great treatise on orchestration in I think the 1840s or so, early 40s, you would expect castanets on occasion, especially where you have Spanish themes. You would expect tambourine on occasion when you have Italian themes. You eventually will have gongs. You will tom-tom is a type of gong that is a noise gong rather than a tone gong. You get that in Bartók's concerto. I didn't even mention the orchestration. I have to go back and do that.
Oh, that's right.
You have side drums, and you have snare drums, and you have bells, and you have wood blocks. So by the time you get to the Bartók-Stravinsky era, in the middle of their careers and in their late careers, the percussion section is a richly variegated sounding troupe of instruments played by a number of players. Usually one is needed solely for the timpani. But then depending on how many percussions are used and how much they're used, you can have another one or two or three more percussionists, or even more on occasion. So the orchestra by Bartók's time is richly joined by the percussionists. And let me give you the instrumentation for that, okay? 3 flutes, with the third flutist doubling as the piccolo player. 3 oboes, with the third doubling as the English horn. 3 clarinets, and the third doubling as bass clarinet. 3 bassoons, the third doubling as contrabassoon. 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, the tuba, the timpani, a percussion group in addition to the timpanist, side drum, cymbals, bass drum, triangle, and tom-tom, alias gong. 2 harps, which have a wonderful role in that piece, glissandos and glistening sounds of harp. And the strings. Our strings, as usual, violins, violas, cellos, basses, and the violin split into firsts and seconds. Sometimes even the other strings in complicated music are playing divisi, meaning some violas have one line and some of them have a second line, same with cellos. So there can be a whole texture of just strings that would have more than 4 or 5 parts. You could have any number of parts depending on how much division you do. But it's a nice, large, but not gargantuan orchestra. Certainly the Strauss orchestra is bigger. Bartók was not so interested in splash. He's interested in just the right sound for what he wants to show, and in the ability for your ears to pick out every single instrument clearly, since this is to feature each and every one of them at some point. So I think that does it.
That's great.